What's up, Wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like it in Magic, and I just couldn't stay away for an entire weekend. This set is pretty much all I can think about because this has kind of been the craziest spoiler season since I became a content creator, and in some ways the most difficult too. Now, Wizards is really getting outside the box here, so it's hard to evaluate some of these cards on their face, and it's even tougher to determine what decks they'll ultimately even go into. So I could have done a lot of stuff this weekend. It was originally my intent to do a top 20 cards spoiled so far thing, but instead I've decided that after a couple of more days of getting to think about these cards, there are just too many of them that are flying way under the radar. They're not being evaluated properly, at least in my opinion, of course. It's all subjective, but there are a few cards that just look insane to me in various ways, and they're just not really getting the attention or appreciation I think they deserve. So today, top 10 underrated cards so far. We'll call it that. Now, I got to start off with an honorable mention. This time around, it's Eternal Taskmaster. The reason this card isn't actually on the list is that I'm not sure that it's juiced quite enough to really see standard play, but there is a lot to like about this card, and people have quickly forgotten about it after a couple of hours of saying it might be good. Haven't heard any more discussion about this card, and I think that's a shame because it does an awful lot for just a 2-mana investment. I've already compared this card to a Sarith, but what I kind of neglected to mention or even think about at the time is how well the card could work in conjunction with Isarith. Isarith can get your Taskmaster back, Taskmaster can start getting other creatures back, and in the late game, that could be a whole lot of resiliency. But even if you're not playing Isarith in the deck, I think that, especially in a zombie tribal deck, this card has really good stats for its mana cost. The 2-mana 2/3 isn't too bad. Hate that it enters tapped, but it's a small price to pay for something that just gives you this massive resilience in the late game. You don't even have to get it through in order to get something back to your hand. And note that unlike Isarith, you don't have to pay the mana cost for the creature or anything. I know it doesn't put the creature right onto the battlefield like Isarith does, which is kind of game-changing, but at the very least, it's going to cost you 3 mana to get literally any creature back from your graveyard and put it in your hand, whether it's a 2-cost creature or a 5 or 6-cost creature. So in some ways, this has more play than a card like Isarith does, just because it's always going to cost you 3, no matter what creature it is, to bring that creature back to your hand, where it might actually in some ways be more protected than it would otherwise be on the board. So there are some really cool things about Taskmaster, best of which is its creature types and its mana cost. I think the card could do things, but I'm not totally confident. Here we are, starting the list. Number 10 is Samit. Now, the reason this is all the way up here at number 10 is because I also don't have a whole lot of confidence that this card will make high-tier standard play, but I'm also not as quick to write it off as a lot of members of the community have been so far. There's a lot of stuff you could play in the 4-drop slot in a Gruul deck, or a mono-red deck, or a mono-green deck. In some ways, that's one of the strengths of this card, is the hybrid mana cost, which is the same on a lot of the underrated walkers so far. People have not really, correctly, in my opinion at least, judged the fact that you can play these in a mono-colored deck. And I think that's a really cool thing about them, but if you're playing mono-green, I've already said you got Vine Mare, you got Nullhide Ferox, there are probably better 4-drops, and in red, Rekindling Phoenix takes priority over this every day. That said, this could always be a 2-of in the 4-drop slot. 4 really aggressive decks, Gruul included, obviously. The ability to give creatures haste 5 times if all goes well and you can keep your Samit protected. And a boost on top of that is really good. She basically casts Samit Strike, or Samit Sprint, which is another card that will come up multiple times today. Samit Sprint almost made the list. It's so decent. I was going to say great, but it's a decent card, and I think it fits in a few lists. We'll talk about it more often today, but this basically lets you cast that card 5 times and does a pretty good Rhythm of the Wild impression while you're at it if you want a little bit of redundancy in your Rhythm of the Wild deck, I like that some of these Planeswalkers are basically just doing an enchantment impression, and this is actually a pretty strong ability to have on an enchantment. It's a Fervor that costs 1 more mana, but it also has the ability to, +2 your creatures 5 times if it doesn't get attacked into or anything. So there is a lot of value to this Planeswalker. The amount of decks it can go in is relatively versatile. There's a lot of things I like about it, but at the same time, again, I will concede that there are probably better things you could be doing in the 4-drop slot. We'll have to wait and see. But here's where things actually take a turn with the series already. With number 9, Ignite the Beacon. I've already said this card is good, but this is another card that people have pretty much moved on from because it was the first card spoiled in the entire set. Other than, I guess, the Johnny's Pride Maid, if you want to count that. But this is the first thing they spoiled on stream at PAX, and we quickly all got over it, and we're like, oh man, it's 5 mana, I don't know about that. But we're all just kind of pretending in Sorcery Speed. And it's not. One thing I said in the spoiler video is that an Esper deck could use this to go fetch up a Teferi and a backup Teferi at the same time. And I had a commenter that was like, no! But like, honestly, I think that is the way this is going to be used. A lot of the time, Esper decks are just trying to, above all else, kind of, to find their Teferi. Keep the board clear, counterspells, find your Teferi so you can actually win the game by out-advantaging your opponent. And finding Teferi is so important for those decks that I could see them playing a one of, at least, Ignite the Beacon, so that not only can you go get the Teferi that you need and cast it on the next turn when you untap, but you'll also just have one sitting in your hand if your opponent does have a Contempt. It's kind of a back-breaking situation, but obviously, Super Friends is going to be a deck that everyone tries to build this season, and looks like a key card in Super Friends to me, so I've really got my eye on Ignite the Beacon. Most people have just not necessarily forgotten about it, but I think that there's a lot of people really cold on this card, and I don't see why it's almost certainly going to see some play. Now, number 8 is 10th District Legionnaire. This actually just came out a couple of days ago, but this is another one that people have seemed to kind of move on from. There has been some discussion about it, but for the most part, I don't think people are taking this or Boros spells very seriously, and maybe they should be. I've already brought up Defiant Strike with this card. That got reprinted too, and Defiant Strike was crazy in heroic decks. It was a bread and butter card for them, and since this is basically a creature with heroic, I expect Defiant Strike to be really, really good with it, especially how things are ordered. You scry before you draw the card. It's all beautiful. But there's also plenty of other stuff. I've already brought up Samit Sprint, but I'll do it again. Samit Sprint is kind of a Titan strength. Sort of a little bit, but not quite. I'd much rather they just reprint Titan Strength, but it does an impression of Titan Strength. And that's also pretty decent with a creature that has heroic. You get the scries, like everything looks good about that interaction, but also even something as innocuous as like Arrestor's Zeal. You throw in Arrestor's Zeal, and suddenly this just swings for 5 on the next turn. There's some really crazy stuff you can do with this card, and some of the combat tricks we have in this format, the pump spells and stuff. And this won't be the last time that pump spells come up. I think Wizards is really trying to get us to play pump spells in Standard for realsies. But this is another good reason to do that, and we'll see plenty more as we go on. Now, number 7 is Heartfire. This is one where I think the casual community has it right. And the spiky, more competitive side of the community probably has it wrong, because the number one take I've seen from the competitive side of things is this worth fitting slots for in the decks that want it? And I can agree with that, but I also look at this as a Shrapnel Blast. And Shrapnel Blast was insane. It's actually a not better, but just easier to proc Shrapnel Blast, because most decks play creatures. But with Shrapnel Blast, your deck has to mostly contain artifacts. Being able to, still attack with the things that you want to sacrifice with this, is actually, that's much better than having to make sure that you have like 30 artifacts in your deck for a card like Shrapnel Blast. So I think this is just a lot easier and not necessarily a better version of Shrap Blast, but in some ways just an easier to cast version of it. And Shrapnel Blast was insane, still is insane. And I think a card like this will be too, especially in the Rakdos aggro deck. Just all the things that this goes with in that deck, If you want to play Grim Initiate, the new, Red Hunted Witness or Doom Traveler, this goes really well with that. Sacrifice Grim Initiate, you get a creature back anyway, so it's just 2 mana for 4 damage to a target. That's good. But there's also, Judith. If you have a Judith out, this deals 5 damage and becomes a legit Shrapnel Blast. Same thing with Footlight Fiend. You sacrifice Footlight Fiend to it, suddenly it is a Shrapnel Blast. Or like Dread Horde Butcher, you've got 2 or 3 counters on Butcher. Suddenly, this deals like 7 or 8 damage. So, it's just insane. All at instant speed too, which is one of the best things about the card. Because if you're playing against control decks that have, Moment of Craving or Cast Down or even, red burn cards in the mirror match, things like Skewer the Critics, Lightning Strike, yada yada. Then an instant speed way to sacrifice creatures that are going to get, that are being targeted by spot removal is actually pretty good, because instead of just losing your guy, yeah, you're kind of down in the exchange. They cast 1 spell, you lost a guy and cast a spell. You're kind of 2-for-1ing yourself in that situation, but you were going to lose that guy anyway, so why not convert it into 4 damage that creature would otherwise have not done? And a really edge interaction here, by the way, is that this can kind of blank exile removal. That's really cool, actually. Things like Lava Coil, Vraska's Contempt, really important cards in the format right now, but even stuff like the Wanderer, if it becomes popular. Being able to, know, whenever they target your guy with Vraska's Contempt, just sacrifice Rekindling Phoenix, deal 4 to them, and get your Phoenix back when you otherwise wouldn't have. That's all of that seems really good to me. Heartfire seems dope, and it goes really well with the Rakdos aggro plan anyway. And one of the biggest problems in that deck was the clock. You know, you get your opponent, I played Rakdos aggro a lot in this last format, you can get your opponent down to like 4 pretty easily, and you can't finish the game off some of the time. Well, luckily, this does 4, and it does it to targets too, not just opponents. So you can take out a Tempest Gen or any other 4 toughness creature, hey Ziggy, with something like this, and that can be really important too, even if all you're doing is taking out like a Rekindling Phoenix for a turn so you can get in. There's just so much Heartfire can do, and if all it does is speed up the clock in those decks and act as another burn spell, it's probably good enough. I like this card if you can't tell. Number 6 is Lazotep Plating. This is kind of backwards. This is the last card was one where I think the casuals have it figured out and the competitive people are overthinking it. This, kind of the other way around. I think that the majority of the casual audience just says that this is a ho-hum kind of card, you know? Why not just play Negate or Dive Down or something like that? Whereas the competitive audience has figured out all kinds of crazy stuff you can do with this, but the most important thing you can do is effectively counter a Banefire. I said that in the video where where this was first spoiled, and I had people in the comment section like, it doesn't counter it. And yet effectively, basically, the end result is that they put their Banefire in the graveyard and it doesn't do anything to you, which is really, really important, especially with a lot of people kind of freaking out about what you can do with, Wilderness Reclamation plus New Teferi plus Banefire to end the game. So a lot of people are trying to be on that plan, and a card like this really safeguards against that. Also note that this stops you from being settled. You can't get Settled the Wreckage because Settled the Wreckage targets you. So this might actually be a pretty decent sideboard piece for mono blue or whatever, white blue aggro, for instance. So there's a lot that I do like about this card. It doesn't necessarily stop sweepers other than Settle the Wreckage, but it will stop other spot removal spells. It'll stop, big spells from targeting you. There's a lot you can do with this. You might even want this, post-board to just counter burn on occasion if there's enough other stuff you can do with it in the matchups where your opponent's playing red. Again, there's just a lot more sort of flexibility on this card than it looks like at first glance. Oh, and by the way, it also gives you a body to block with. I talked about this in the spoiler video too, but I just really want to hammer it home how cool I think that interaction is. If you get hit with Lightning Strike and you're at 3 or 4, something like that, you really don't want to get hit with Lightning Strike, counter their Lightning Strike effectively, counter their Lightning Strike with a plating, and then you put a blocker into play to block their Viashino Pyromancer in trade or something. There's just a lot of really cool stuff about this card, and I'm not sure that everyone's seeing the sort of versatility a card like this carries. Number 5 is Samir, shamelessly. I actually wanted to make this number 1 because, this is another one where the majority of the competitive community is like, it's not good enough. And I just don't get it. Everything I know about evaluating cards makes this look like a pretty good card. You get a wide board, 2 bodies off of it for 5 mana, totaling 6 power, which is okay by itself. It's Crested Herd Caller, which isn't anything to write home about. But against the control decks this is supposed to be bad against, it at least presents the opponent with 2 relatively high-profile targets to have to kill. They can take out Teferi pretty easily as a team, or they can just start swinging for 6 a turn. Even if your opponent's able to spot removal 1, you're still putting them on kind of a clock with a 3-power creature in a control deck. Making them, sweep you is actually kind of a big deal for those control decks. Plus, again, against pretty much everything but control, this is a really, really powerful card. A lot of people are just taking how this card might play against control as evidence the card is bad, which I understand, considering Esper is a very powerful deck in the format. But against most mid-range and aggro decks, this card is absolutely insane. And here's just a scrolling list of the stuff that the Wolf token can either kill or trade with when it comes out. And yes, by the way, it can trade with a Goblin Chain Whirler because First Strike doesn't matter outside of combat. Fights, I know it sounds crazy, but fighting like this isn't combat. So, just in case you're one of those people that's like, Goblin Chain Whirler kills the wolf, it doesn't do nothing. Actually, they do trade. But outside of that, there are a bunch of other creatures I've already scrolled past that are either played in Standard or, possible played in Standard. Even stuff like Legion Lieutenant, Merfolk Mistbinder that don't see a ton of play. We'll see some play on Arena in Vampire and Merfolk decks and stuff. So, there's just plenty of stuff the wolf can kill by itself immediately and leave, stay out even. So it's possible that this is like a 4-for-1 if you count the life You know, if you count the life, that's 3 life. You get rid of something on their side of the battlefield, you get 2 guys. That is a 4-4-1, ladies and gentlemen, and I think that in a lot of ways this is right up there with like Ravenous Chupacabra. And if you go back and look at the, you know, the Spikes subreddit when Chupacabra came out, everyone was like, oh yeah, this is really good. This will see a lot of play. This is a great card right here. Till Samir comes out and everyone's like, no, this is bad. I just do not get it at all. I know Ravenous Chupacabra can kill bigger creatures. I get that. You don't have to comment it. I obviously know that. I'm not dumb, but this still will kill a majority of creatures in this format that we're worried about right now. Not only aggro stuff, but also like Thief of Sanity, and that's really important. There's just really cool stuff this card does right now. Leave you with 2 bodies on the battlefield, and oh yeah, put you right back in the game against aggro by gaining you a little bit of life. Not to mention killing a guy. So I just don't... Everything I know about card evaluation tells me that this is a very good card, and I do not get the sort of milquetoast reaction to it from most of the competitive community. Okay, sorry for the rant there, but I'm going to keep doing that as we move forward, because my number 4 is Cranko. Now, the number 1 argument against this card is that Legion Warboss exists, but I actually think, in a lot of ways, this is better than Legion Warboss. You know, a lot of formulas have been posted to the Spike subreddit. It feels like 5 different people posted the same formula, where, you know, it takes a few turns for Cranko to crank out just as much value as a Legion Warboss, because Warboss goes ahead and gets started the turn it hits the battlefield by making you creatures that turn. Cranko you have to wait a turn for, and that highly devalues the card. That much I agree with, but Cranko starts getting, you know, power onto the battlefield better than Legion Warboss, like the 3rd turn it's on the battlefield. And that's actually not very long, especially if you're just trying to outvalue a control deck and put a bunch of sweep, you know, a bunch of threats on the board, force a sweeper. I think in a lot of ways this is better than Warboss at doing that. Warboss doesn't have to attack to make goblins, which is another thing that makes it look a little bit better than this, but Warboss also doesn't get bigger over time, and pump spells have really no effect. Other than letting it mentor bigger stuff, I guess. You could say that about Warboss, but pump spells on Cranko are insane. This is another one where I have to bring up Samit's Sprint. And I've got 4 mana to spare. Cranko can hit the board and immediately make like 4 tokens for you. You know, 1 from his power, 1 for the +1/+1 counter, and then 2 for the boost that you get from Sprint. So that's good, right? I mean, going ahead and making a bunch of tokens the turn he enters the battlefield is fine. You're spending 2 cards, but you're getting a bunch. You know, you're getting 5. So that seems pretty good as far as I'm concerned. But there's also a bunch of other stuff. You know, we just got Giant Growth back. 1 mana for +3/+3, and suddenly he's cranking out like 5 goblin tokens if he's, you know, at starting power, so that's good. Also, I shouldn't have to say this, but Collision Colossus. You cast Colossus on this, and suddenly you're getting a buttload of tokens, and he's getting through for like 6 trample at the very least, if he hasn't gotten counters before that. So I think that Cranko could actually be absolutely insane in this format, and we're all just kind of downplaying it because Legion Warboss exists, but I think the ceiling on this card is much higher than Warboss, even if Warboss, I will admit, is a little bit easier to get value out of, and that probably does make it the better card for all intents, but I still don't think that you can ignore the kind of value that Cranko can bring to the table in just a couple of turns, especially given the solid amount of pump spells we have in the format. Now, my number 3 is probably the most under-the-radar card of the day. If this were just a measure of like which cards are not being paid attention to the most, this would be number 1, but I'm also factoring in how good the card could actually be in Standard. So my number 3, starting off the top 3 here, is Widespread Brutality. I have been really surprised more people aren't talking about this card. Mostly, all the, you know, sweeper praise has gone to Time Wipe in this set. A card that I do like, absolutely, but I'm still paying attention to Brutality. Even if you don't have any army out when you cast the card, it's still a 4-mana Pyroclasm that leaves a body on the battlefield, which might be pretty good against maybe mono white decks. I know Banalish Marshall could throw things off there, but, you know, mono red aggro decks, even mono blue aggro decks, this could be fantastic against if you can resolve it on turn 4. So I like that about the card, but in any deck where you can get any army going whatsoever, this card looks phenomenal to me. You know, you've got Grim Initiate in the format right now. I've already brought that card up, but we've also got Lazotep Reaver, a card that I wanted to bring up a couple of other times in this video. Reaver is another card that I really, really like from this set that I don't think is getting quite enough attention, you know. Kind of a black goblin instigator that also has a pretty decent creature type too. So I like that card. And it goes really well with this too, for lots of reasons, For one, obviously you play Reaver on turn 2, and then you get this on turn 4, and suddenly your army is an Anger of the Gods. It does 3 damage to everything like a Deafening Clarion would. And you have a 3/3 army out that's left behind. The ability to sweep the board and still have a creature out is just good. That seems good without me having to really explain why. It's almost a one-sided board wipe, and those are good, especially at a rate like this. Even if you're not jumping through any hoops and you're just getting the 2 damage, I think it's kind of fine in some matchups if you do that. But, if you're actually able to build up an army and make this do 3 to 5 damage, it's just an insane card, and it's not entirely dead against control either. It's a sweeper that at least puts a body on the battlefield. If nothing else, it puts a body on the battlefield. So sometimes you'll pay 4 for a 2/2 against control. The thing is, it's not dead against control, and pretty much every other sweeper is. So I like that about the card too. I think there's too many cool things about Widespread Brutality to just let it fall by the wayside. This is a good card. Now, my number 2 is Kiora. This looks fantastic to me. And actually, I was beaten too. There's a couple people on Twitter yesterday were like, hey, you guys are sleeping on Kiora. I agree with those Twitter users. Turns out Kiora is just so busted looking to me. There's a lot of 3-mana walkers we've seen so far, but this is probably the best in terms of raw power and usability from what I can tell. I like Vivian a lot, I like Zhang Yang Yu, and obviously I like Davriel. But this, in terms of actual competitive playability, I think this one might be the one that's the most there. Being able to untap a permanent is great because this is effectively a mana dork with haste. In some ways, this just costs 2 mana to cast, given that you have 3 lands to start with. So that's pretty cool. You can put it into play, untap, and immediately cast a Lana War Elves, Incubation Incongruity, or something like a Terramander, or there's lots of stuff. Adventurous Impulse. I could go on. An Opt even. There's just tons of stuff you could do. The turn you play this, and that's not even mentioning Mox Amber, which I have to bring up. Mox Amber could be greatly improved with this set. A card you guys know I've had way too much faith in for way too long, but we did just get another, white legend the other day to go with Imara and Shauna if we need to build that deck. But we also got, Fibblethip as a 2-mana legend and tons of 3-mana walkers. So if you go Kiora into Mox Amber on turn 3, now you can cast a 2-drop, and that looks really, really good to me. Not to mention that if you go like Lana War Elves turn 1, Kiora turn 2, you can untap your Lana War Elves to get back on defense and protect your Kiora. That's pretty cool. Or you can just untap a land or a Lana War Elves again to cast something else. All that's sweet on turn 2. You have a huge board really, really early in the game in that case. But starting on turn 3, if you drop a land, you have access to 5 mana on turn 3, which means that you could easily make use of her claws that let you draw cards for casting big creatures. So there's just so much you can do with this Kiora, whether it's, just ramping big stuff into play and drawing cards off of it, or just giving creatures like pseudo-vigilance. You can do that with her too when need be. So there's a lot of versatility, a lot of flex on Kiora, and not only is this one of my favorite walkers of all time, but this is one of the few times I can say that they really did her justice in this set. I like this Kiora an awful lot, and I think it's bound to see some play. But here we go with number 1, you guys. What could it possibly be? It is Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is one that I've seen a lot of people refuse to stop talking about, but mostly out of frustration with the fact that this card isn't getting enough talk. This card looks great not only in Standard, but it could also have Modern implications. There's plenty of cool things you can do with this in Modern. Recast Faithless Looting naturally. That seems really, really good. Or, by the way, you could just cast things for free, like Living End or Ancestral Visions. Yeah, it's another card that lets you do that. And you always got to look out for stuff like that. But in Standard, just in Standard alone, here's a list of some things that this goes really well with. Just like I did with Samir, there's a bunch of, just 1 mana instants and sorceries in this format right now. This goes really, really well with. I've already brought up a few that could go well. I'll say one more time, Samit Sprint. Samit Sprint is an extremely undervalued card that does an impression of Titan Strength, if nothing else, and goes extremely well with this. You just play Samit Sprint on it. Let's say actually it doesn't matter what turn you're on. Let's just say you're able to get this string. You play Dreadhorde Arcanist, then you play Samit Sprint on it. You attack and you recast, say, a Wizard's Lightning from your graveyard. That's all of that is a crazy string. And just starting on turn 3, you can start doing insane stuff like that. You know, so I think just with pump spells, this goes insanely well, and I've already brought up like Arrestor's Zeal and Giant Growth, Collision Colossus. You know, if you Colossus this, then suddenly you can cast you can cheat and just cast insane crap out of your graveyard with this. Double Giant Growth it, and then you can either Giant Growth it again if you want to do that, or you can just cast something outrageous for 7 mana out of your graveyard. If you want to live the Timmy Dream, you can do that, but the card is just good enough on its face in terms of raw power that you almost never have to cast a pump spell, because there are tons of 1-mana cards you can abuse with this. I've already mentioned Faithless Looting in Modern, but in Standard we've got all those 1-mana pump spells, plus things like Opt, you know, Adventurous Impulse, and note too, by the way, that this allows you to sort of cheat and play sorceries kind of at instant speed. It's not quite a combat trick, your opponent still sees it coming, but imagine casting like, say, a Gird for Battle, for instance. With this at effectively sorcery speed. That seems pretty good. Or, for that matter, by the way, like Warlord's Fury. You know, that's sorcery speed, but if you've already cast it that game, you can easily cast without even having to pump your Arcanist. You can cast it out of your graveyard, give everything first strike on your team, and draw another card. You know, if you're just looking at Arcanist as card advantage in that way, you know, recasting Warlord's Furies and Crash Throughs and Ops and stuff out of your graveyard, then it is free card advantage whenever it attacks. It doesn't even have to get through. So this card just looks crazy to me. There's way too many applications that make it busted in multiple formats for people to kind of keep their heads down on it right now. And even though there has been some talk about the card, I do think the majority of the community's head is down on this as we look at exciting planeswalkers and stuff, as we move through spoiler season, crazy legends like Massacre Girl, I still can't say her name. But, you know, there's just been a ton of really exciting stuff that's come out, mostly in the form of planeswalkers. And it's led a lot of people to move on or forget about this card, and I don't think we should. I think it's easily one of the best cards we've seen so far. And that's it. That's it for me so far, at least. I'm sure there will be way more underappreciated cards before it's all over. I'll get my sleepers video out when the set. That's what I'm looking for. When the set is all out, you get my sleepers video, my top 50, all that stuff coming out soon. But we've still got a couple more weeks in spoiler season and my exclusive preview to get to, which occurs on the 15th of this month. Make sure you're subscribed for all that. Spoiler action, my exclusive preview, deck tech season, lists. You know, if you haven't subbed yet, now's the time. It's a good time to be a Magic player. So, and this is just the craziest spoiler season ever. Like, This is one for the ages, y'all. But in any case, hope you've been enjoying the content so far. It's been a pretty exciting set to cover. And again, if you have, make sure you subbed, like the video. If you enjoyed the video, do all those things. And let me know in the comments anything I missed. You know, something that you like and I didn't mention here. Like, for instance, Kaya's Ghost Form. You probably might bring that card up. A lot of people like that card. But just anything that you think is sort of unsung so far in this set, let me know about down there in the comments section. It's a cool conversation to have. But aside from that, go to TCG Player if you want to pre-order anything from the set. They help sponsor my content, but they are where you're going to get these cards and, you know, sealed, unopened product too on pre-order for the cheapest on the internet. So check them out and check out the Patreon if you really want to help support the channel and keep things going around here. You know, I'd probably do this even if I only made like $10 a month. It's just really fun. I could never stop doing this, but, you know, at least reward my hard week. Like 60 plus hours a week goes into doing this. So help me keep doing it. You know, $1 a month is all I ask. Just hit up the Patreon down there, and you can help determine what decks we even do this season in the first place via polls and such. So if you're excited about that, throw $1 into the channel every month. It'll be greatly appreciated. But I guess that is more or less it. We actually had Ziggy here like almost the entire time this video, at least about the halfway point. That was good. I haven't seen Ziggy in a while. When I'm on the couch, he likes to hang out, so I should do more couch stuff. Anyway, I think, oh, buddy. I think that's it for now, y'all. You got anything you want to ask or any cards I didn't mention, hit me up in the comments section down there, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind. Meow. Oh, buddy. You're so sweet. You're the sweetest bub.